Well, Australia could be facing a long-term investment shortfall due to the cost of Australian workers. An international study by accountancy firm UHY Hains Norton reveals superannuation, workers' comp and payroll tax cost a business over $13,000 for each employee earning $75,000. So are we at risk of losing the next investment boom? Well, for more, we're joined by UHY Hains Norton Australia Managing Partner, David Tomasi. David, thanks so much for your time. Better just start by giving us an overview of your company. What is UHY Hains Norton all about?
Well, thanks, Ingrid. UHY Hains Norton is a mid-tier chartered accounting firm, and we have offices in all the major centres in Australia and New Zealand, and we're a member of UHY International with 270 offices in 86 countries.
All right, tell us a little bit about this study and how it was compiled.
Well, this study is the next of a series of studies we've been conducting, and this one in particular looked at employment on costs, and our studies tend to focus on the cost of doing business for employers, and to focus on how that affects their capacity to actually do business.
Okay, so I wasn't particularly surprised by the fact that Australia's got such high costs. We know we've been hearing a lot about it, specifically lately. Were you surprised by the findings?
No, really, it just confirmed what we already knew, that Australia is a high wage cost environment.
How much of this has to do with the high Aussie dollar?
Well, the high Aussie dollar contributes, as you heard when in your previous story you just had, when the Aussie dollar, with such a high Aussie dollar, when our the cost of gold plummets, or the price of gold plummets, the miners start to look at, you know, what their cash costs are, and of course employment costs are a big factor in cash costs, but the Aussie dollar really forces up our costs when compared to those overseas competitors. And it really comes down to costs here versus what we can do things offshore, or what things can be produced by other countries.
Okay, so what else is pushing the cost in Australia up besides the Aussie dollar in comparison to places like the USA and Canada?
Well, look, the employment cost itself, the wage cost, is a big factor in anything you do, and the US is a really good example at the moment, because at the moment they have an overcapacity in their industry. So they're underutilising their infrastructure. So not only that, their employment costs are much lower than ours to start with. So when we look at our on-costs study that we did, we see that our on-costs relative to the US are much higher, and that's on a higher wage cost to start with. So it just pushes, or it just really affects our competitiveness, particularly when you take into account the effect of the Aussie dollar at the moment.
What about in comparison to the rest of the world? Because I know you did a whole list of countries.
Yeah, well, in comparison to the rest of the world, we are a high-cost wage environment. So even though China, for instance, you look at the China results, they had a 30% on cost on top of their wages, and Australia's was only 17.5%. But that, of course, is 30% on a much lower base. So when you actually add up the total cost per hour of labour in China, it is still very much lower than that here in Australia. And when you think about that story, that story you had just a little while ago, China's manufacturing capacity, they've got huge resources there. So it's certainly not something that we're going to be able to compete with on a pure cash basis.
Yep. I want to ask you, what's the impact of these higher wages on productivity in the energy and resource sector? Do you think it's as simple as higher wages equals higher productivity?
No. You see, productivity is a big factor, and it's a big factor to play here, and it's something that I think that governments can really do a lot with, because when you are a high wage cost, when you're in a high wage cost economy, one of your only weapons you have is productivity. And our productivity levels have been slipping relative to the rest of the world in the last few years. And that's an area that we really need to look at, because if we don't suddenly reduce red tape and make it easier for people to do business, we need to get back. We need to do that so we can get back to employees actually producing, rather than being, you know, struck down with the burden of compliance. And red tape is a big factor and a big area that the government can really work on.
So is Australia really lacking competitiveness compared to the rest of the world, do you think?
Oh, we certainly are. And the fact is, you know, we can still cut it on some things, but, you know, we've got to look to the future, and we've got to continue to think about how we're going to manage this going forward. It's not about, you know, where we sit at the moment and this factory's currently producing something that gets exported. These threats that are coming at us, we really need to be able to fight against them.
Does high wage costs in Australia make it harder or easier to retain staff? Because it looks like in your report it says our competitors can more easily retain staff, but I would have thought it'd be the other way around with higher wages here.
No, certainly higher wages would. Higher wages mean that people enjoy working here, but and we do attract people to Australia for those reasons. But you know, it also comes at a price too. You know, our higher wage costs here mean there's a much higher cost of living, and you have to look at the overall relativity to your actual cost of living when you try and factor that in, because you know, house prices here in recent years, as we know, have certainly gone exponential when compared to a lot of other countries around the world.
Sure. So the point of this report is it really to call on the state and federal government to do something about this and help increase productivity?
Yeah, well, productivity is one thing. That's certainly an area. Obviously, state governments could help business by reducing some of the taxes, and payroll tax, and giving payroll tax relief is obviously something that state governments can do. The federal governments can also look at how to reduce perhaps some of the corporate tax, and that certainly has been in the news of late, and even recently with the opposition making some statements, and last year with the reduction in company tax being put on hold. So that doesn't make it easy, particularly for the small to medium enterprises that are out there at the moment struggling against the current factors in the economy.
All right, David Tomasi, UHY Hains Norton Australian Managing Partner. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, Ingrid.